And welcome. It is a SkeetNet special. Tonight I'm joined by Andrew Bentley, who is a Green Party councillor for Douglas, and Devon Watson, a member of the Manx Labour Party, newly installed only last September. And this evening we're going to talk about the Manx housing crisis. Many of you will have seen the headline in the press today on the media that house prices rose by a massive average £19,000, which is about 6.75%. So we're kind of in a line up on the screen. Andrew is next to me via Skype. So did you see the headline today? What were your thoughts?
Not surprised. There's been a problem. The houses are selling as fast as they come on the market. And that's the news that I get from the estate agents when I speak to them, that they could sell all the houses they want. And certainly when I look in the estate agents' windows, you start to notice now that there's a lot of very big properties in the £1-2 million bracket where you just get the feeling that the people who've sat in them for years are just being speculative now and seeing what they can get for them. I don't know if anyone else has seen that sort of phenomenon. I mean, it's watching those phenomenon that are interesting. I mean, Devon was the one who pointed out to me the phenomenon that increasingly the houses at the other end of the market, the flats, are just marketed now as investment opportunities. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. And I find it's now the same with these huge houses that, quite frankly, in many cases are just big and rather bland, are going for unbelievable sums of money.
And tell me, Andrew, who's buying them?
You know what? I don't know, and they probably the purchasers don't want you to know who they are, for a guess. I don't know if they're local. I don't know if they're people coming from across. I couldn't tell you that, and probably the estate agents don't want to give away the names of their customers. But I'm sure it will appear in the paper. But who these people are, we don't know.
Come on, Devon. You're a great proponent of this. What's your take on it?
Yeah, the most interesting thing is looking at the stats. So I sent you through a graphic a little bit earlier talking about house price ratios. So when we talk about the housing crisis, the first thing that pops into mind are is homelessness, and young couples who are unable to sort of start families as a result. But this can be easily summarized in a number. So the easiest number is talking about house price affordability ratio. And what this is it talks about how many years using 100% of your salary, assuming you don't eat, you don't buy anything, you don't use transport, you just live in a cocoon. If you just spend your entire salary on buying a house, how many years' salary would that take? So in Liverpool, it's about roughly 7.5, I believe. In major European cities, the ratio sits between 7 and 10. And what we notice on the Isle of Man is this has jumped dramatically. So in Washington, D.C., it's about 5 years' salary. In Liverpool, it's about 8 years' salary. Manchester, 7.5 years' salary. Sydney, a famously expensive housing market, is 9 years' salary. New York is 10 years' salary. On the Isle of Man, your median salary is £30,000. And now that the average Isle of Man house is £310,000, on the Isle of Man, it is now 10 times your salary. So we're cropping up in terms of New York relative to income, in terms of how unaffordable housing is on the Isle of Man. That number gets worse when you recognize that our average or median income is dragged up dramatically by the existence of a few billionaires and a few multi-millionaires, which drag up the average quite considerably.
This is something that Chris Thomas did say in a presentation that I went to. He said that one of the things that we have in the Isle of Man is that the government used to put the average income. And then he said, well, we need to start showing the mean income, because that's more indicative of what people actually earn. And the numbers weren't very good. So the government very quickly went back to the average income because it looked more favourable to what people were earning. So, yes, what Devon's saying is absolutely right there.
Yeah. So Manx housing is in like pretty high up in terms of global unaffordability. So in terms of what you're earning, if you're a young professional, you're paying just as much of your salary into sort of like buying a home one day as you would in New York or a major city in the UK. So why live in Douglas? Why live in Ramsey? And why not leave? And that is why we see for every two Manx people who leave, we only have one who arrives or one who comes back home. So we've got this massive exodus of young people driven by the fact that, in part, one is a lack of opportunities, and secondly, is a lack of opportunities wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if housing itself was cheap. But it's currently impossible for many people to set up families, so you've got no choice but to leave. Our economic conditions are forcing people out. And long term, that's a recipe for disaster.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, both of you there, and really the cost of housing. So you're talking about 10 years salary without spending anything, and just remember, to even get a mortgage now, you're looking at a 20% deposit, which is just out of reach. Now, if we try and estimate, well, what is the average, say, rent per month for an average, couple who are going to be young, aren't they? They might have a family. If they're in rented accommodation, they're going to be paying between 800 and 1,000 and more, aren't they? Is that an agreeable sum?
Yeah, so like your average, like an okay-ish one-bedroom place, just for one person, single person, 650, maybe 700. If you're a couple occupying the same place, the prices can range anywhere between 1,200 to 800 pounds to as low as 600 if you're going to want to put up with damp. And sort of accept the cost of long-term health issues down the road in exchange for cheaper rents. But your mortgage for these places would be 200 to 400 pounds a month. So the only thing that is people have their disposable income cut in half, most of it going to rent. When if they just had a tiny bit of capital behind them, they would have the capacity to be homeowners and accrue an asset at the same time.
But the cost of living. So, Andrew, what are the typical costs that we've got? We've got your fuel, your food, your clothing, your general socials. That's got to be tipping £1,000 a month easy. That's fair, isn't it?
Certainly, we have the cost of living here that's higher. That's compensated for by lower tax. I think it's the housing is almost something that can almost be seen in isolation, in that sense that it's that getting onto the housing ladder, which, I mean, they tried other schemes. I mean, we had the first time buyer scheme back in the early 2000s, which worked very well for those who were lucky enough to win a lottery ticket and get one of those houses where, I mean, it was a time when housing was increasing in price at a faster rate than it is now. And the island's population was increasing at a faster rate than it is now. And I can remember a friend of mine got one of the houses in Harcroft, and he told me how much he was paying for it on the first time buyer scheme. And by the time the thing was actually, from when he'd signed up to it to when it was actually built and he'd moved in, he'd literally paid half the market value. So as a scheme, it was great to get people into houses and owning their own houses. For the wider taxpayer, it was very unfair in that these houses were then eventually, after I think it was 21 years, reverted to their market value. Essentially, you'd just given people £100,000, which isn't really a sustainable solution to the problem. I know that there's been lots of conversations that they had. I used to work in the Department of Local Government and the Environment, and I did hear some of the discussions that were going on at the time. I think shared equity was always one that they looked into, where the taxpayer got a stake in the house that when it appreciated, the taxpayer hadn't subsidised somebody else's capital gain, which isn't unreasonable. But if the goal is to get people into houses, that's the name of the game. That's it's eyes on the prize.
Well, a couple.
I mean, we already do have quite a few schemes at the moment that do subsidise the cost of home ownership, such as the interest on a mortgage. That's a tax deductible expense. That's something the Manx taxpayer pays about £5 million in every year. That's something that could pay for something like free public transport, but instead it goes to people who are already on the market. And if you look at the way that we've constructed our model of housing, is that it's specifically based around protecting currently existing homeowners, whether it's implicit or implicit. So when we create processes that make it harder to construct new housing, or we have things that artificially delay the construction of new housing, this has a massive impact on people who aren't already on the market. And the problem with first-time buyer schemes and assistance to get in general, a lot of my friends use first-time buyer. This provided the basis for which people in their 30s have now become homeowners, and they've had the stability to build families. It's been great for a generation of people who managed to get on it. But the problem is that if you just make it easy to buy houses, you just mean that the cheap housing stock that already exists gets bought up, and then prices appreciate for the people who come in after that scheme expires. So the only way of solving the problem is to specifically go out and create social housing, rent it out at cheap rates, and assist people at each spectrum, at each stage of the spectrum of housing. And I think having a more direct solution to this problem is the only option at this point.
Well, we've just had a few comments come in on the board there, and we've got Simon telling us that the house prices rose by 6.75, and the UK folk currently have 139 billion of unspent money. So I think we know what's happening there. A question from Jared. Which banks require a 20% deposit? My understanding it is the regular local banks that are asking that, unless I'm going to be proved different. So there's certainly a lot of challenges, and we're not seeing a great deal of construction of public housing, are we, Andrew?
No, there is some. Don't get me wrong. They've rebuilt Clyde Vane, but that's not a net increase. Douglas Council, we're building the current flats up by the Brown Bobby. I think that's going to be about 60 flats, but generally they're aimed at replacing flats that have seen better days in Lord Street. I think that's all part of a long-term programme there. And we've also got flats in the planning system at the moment, although the funding hasn't been completely blessed by the Department of Infrastructure, for another 48 flats in Williston. But again, to a certain degree, that is replacement of existing flats. So it's not a significant increase in the quantity of public sector housing. So
the last time I think that there was a massive increase in the quantity of social housing in Douglas was in the 90s. Incidentally, I think Douglas was one of the only local councils in the British Isles that continued to build housing in the 90s, a little bit after on. But yeah, the share of public sector housing relative to total housing in Douglas has been falling for a number of years, because it's viewed rather as like a part of the welfare state that provides a bedrock for the vast majority of low-income families. It's viewed as an expense, or it's viewed as a burden. And the way in which people discuss social housing, it's viewed as something that's a burden on taxpayers rather than a core fundamental foundation of building of post-war British society. And I think they're absolutely vital. Just as one example, if you're earning the minimum wage, you're taking home maybe £1,200 a month. That's before tax. That gives you, if you're living in Douglas, a disposable income, if you're just like eating rice and beans, of about £200 a month. And that's if you're renting private accommodation, spending £600 on a flat. If you're in social housing, that flat will cost you £200, and your disposable income has tripled, right? So for the cost of providing the social housing to this person, their disposable income has tripled. They have the capacity to save. They have the capacity to search for other jobs that are more high paying. They've got the ability to upgrade their qualifications later on. They have the capacity to spend more money in local businesses. So, I mean, it's absolutely fundamental that we reinvest in social housing.
I think this is a very, very good point, that that money doesn't disappear. It is money in the local economy. You are freeing up money that would otherwise be paying quite possibly for very wealthy people to go on 4 cruises a year. And that's kind of a reality with a lot of these houses, that some of them aren't, they're not owned by people by the hundred. Many of them are 2 or 3 houses that were owned by an investment as a sort of a pension nest egg. And, I'm not going to criticize the individuals for doing it, because, they're only looking after themselves, but it's the system that allows it. And yeah, they can make a nice little sum of money out of an asset that appreciates at the same time.
But this cosy system is now at full capacity, and it's generated into a magnificent money-making machine, a superb investment earner ahead of any bank interest rate. And we're looking at these developments. We've got one in Ballasalla where all the property has been acquired, and I'm just trying to think. I mean, maybe Andrew, you've got the head on this. Is that I thought that there was an agreement that for any new development, 25% had to be affordable housing. I'm sure
that's correct.
I'm sure I've seen that. How does that fit in? I'm not quite witnessing that.
Housing policy 12, I think, off the top of my head. 25% of all properties in a development of 8 or more houses have to be available for affordable housing. You don't necessarily have to provide that. You can also make a payment to the Department of Infrastructure to be invested in affordable housing by the Department of Infrastructure if you don't want to provide affordable housing within your development. But yes, that's what the rules say. It's a housing policy.
I've got
and you have to come to an agreement with the Department of Infrastructure at the time.
Okay, I've got Jared coming in with a couple of points. The current first-time buyer schemes are shared equity schemes, and it would be worth checking with each of the high street banks what deposit they require. Normal high street banks, Isle of Man, Lloyds, Barclays, HSBC, Santander, as they will each have different requirements and different mortgage packages. I think it will be worth checking. And Jared, if you're at the desk, maybe you could just do a bit of searching and just come up with the answers for there. But I know that certainly one of the
I've been
banks...
I've been trying to find a mortgage myself. So if you're lucky, Santander can offer you as low as 5%, but they won't offer that for flats and apartments, which are the sort of things that the sort of people who benefit most from a low deposit rate are people who are now sort of locked out of that, which is just general banking policy. I know that Barclays has recently risen theirs from 10 to 15%, as has HSBC risen their requirement from 10 to 15%. So I could be wrong on the HSBC, but I've been shopping around for mortgages, and that's what I get told, is that my savings, I need to save for another year or two, maybe more, in order to sort of get that next step up, in order to get that first flat. Because since COVID, increased volatility means banks have been shoring up their assets, which means that they hike deposit rates. So the big trade-off in terms of getting greater fiscal stability more generally is the fact that mortgages are much harder to get. It's necessary that we've shored up the financial system. We don't want another 2008. But ultimately, the people who are hurt the most are people who are working in middle class, while the people who actually caused the crisis in the first place by gambling bank deposits and gambling with ordinary people's mortgages, they just make increased money out of interest now. And it's these sort of things that make people increasingly frustrated with the current economic system and increasingly frustrated with the current political system.
Well, I think it's fair to say that swift action needs to be taken for the incoming government in September. Just throw it out to you. What sort of ideas should be put forward to the electorate? Because this is going to be the burning issue for election 21 in September. There's no question about it. It's the future of the Isle of Man. It's retaining young people. It's giving hope and prosperity, really, to young people embarking on a career. It's the full deck, really, isn't it, Andrew?
Well, it depends which one of us you want to ask, in that what we'd want to see or what we'd be expected to see, but we'd probably agree on a lot of what we'd expect the other one to say. That we've got 2 issues. Number one, we are now signed up to achieving net zero climate carbon emissions by 2050, and we have to accept that in a service-based economy, nearly all our carbon emissions are largely to do with housing. Not nearly all, sorry, but the biggest chunk of our CO2 emissions come from buildings and the power that they consume. So it's got to be in our radar that we have to deal with not only the emissions in new buildings, but also the emissions in existing buildings, and we've got to do something about it.
That's an excellent point. Just to throw a stat in there. So when we look at the emissions provided per buildings, so I'm a very big fan of the phrase people can walk and chew gum at the same time. So the way that these policies are very often phrased, and this is something that Andrew and I both generally agree on, is that people criticize environmental policies by saying they're bad for ordinary working and middle class people. Your average person in the street who has to battles to make ends meet, they can't afford environmentalism, and this is objectively false. So as we raise if we use the Scottish definition, 15% of the Manx population reside in fuel poverty, which means as though they spend a disproportionate amount of their income trying to heat their homes. If we manage to invest the money in improving the efficiency of homes, improving the efficiency of insulation, and building new homes that are up to passive house standard, long term, we as a country save money by not importing fuel, and we as a country save money by freeing up people's income that would otherwise be spent on substandard heating systems on other parts of the economy. Additionally, the fact that we have a massive problem within Manx homes of damp at the moment. So the fact that because houses aren't heated well enough, people refuse to open their windows to allow condensation out, which means as though damp accumulates. This is a problem when people both live in a place that's cold and also don't have a lot of money, that like the short-term saving of money by retaining heat in your home causes damp issues long-term. And it's difficult to explain to a kid, windows, and so families end up places. So yeah, the only way to improve and sort of maintain our housing stock is to make these investments today, because if we have to make them in 10 or 15 years from now.
This is something I've always said. I've never considered green is just about making sensible long-term decisions. That in the case of building, if somebody invests in making the running costs of the house as low as possible, instead we live in a situation, and it's not just in the Isle of Man, it's Britain as well, where most of our houses are made by volume house builders, which is a very efficient way of making houses. If you have 200 houses that are identical and one team that are putting them up, you get massive economies of scale. But ultimately, they want to build the house for the lowest price possible and lowest cost possible, and sell it for the highest price possible, because that's their profit and that's what they do. And it's that long-term view that what's always held it back is the idea that, but that'll make the house more expensive, but then your running costs are more expensive. So to me, you're either paying for it in your mortgage or you're paying for it in your heating and electric bills. And the chances are that by the time you've paid off your mortgage, you'll have probably saved more in your energy bills, and you've got greater certainty, unless, it depends on what type of mortgage you get, obviously. But we just don't know what's going to happen with fuel, as we know from about 10 years ago when the price of oil went absolutely through the roof.
I think we've got a good idea that fossil fuels are going to diminish, they're going to become more expensive, and generally the Isle of Man public will want less use of them. And we're an island that is furnished with a lot of money, and yet in the last 5 years we've had an administration that hasn't really moved forward at all. We've had the climate policy, which was almost forced on them, and we've had some very active MLCs and a couple of MHKs who've driven it forward. But you'd think when the whole world is moving at a pace to deal with this, The Isle of Man. I mean, Devon, you must be pulling your hair out.
It's frustrating because I mean we had commitments in 2001, 2006, 2011, 2016. The one made in 2011 committed that by now we'd have 15% of our power produced through renewables, and that just objectively isn't the case. I mean, we are allocating money toward climate change mitigation strategies, but a lot of that money is going toward doing things that would otherwise be in the DOI or MUA budget anyway. And we are still yet to see a single turbine erected, either onshore or offshore. We fail to see any serious consideration of renewable energies at a local authority level. And I know Andrew is keen on this one. But the fact that we tried to install as Douglas Council solar panels in Williston, and the DOI said no because the short-term cost would be too high. This is money that would have saved money in terms of energy bills long-term, and within less than a decade they would have paid themselves back if we go by any sort of conventional metrics of how they perform in the private sector. So it's very, very frustrating that we've been blocked every way. And on one hand, the government talks about they want to do something with climate change. On the other hand, they're slashing bus routes and they're reducing the amount of money you get for producing green energy. It's hypocrisy, and it's completely inefficient, especially given the fact that a private jet is taxed at 0%, and yet we're going to make it harder for ordinary people to have boilers or fossil fuel vehicles. It's one of those things whereby our solutions to climate change should definitely not be things that just punish poor and normal, ordinary people.
Well, there's no doubt about it. If you're not earning a lot of money, it's very difficult to be green aware and green caring, isn't it, Andrew? Just the simple one is to buy an electric car, isn't it? That is the simple one, and then if you manage to get to do that, they've even put tax on it, or they're suggesting about putting tax on it in years to come.
I think electric cars are ones that, I mean, remember that's an infant technology. It's not quite an infant technology, but it's an adolescent technology now. But we're seeing that the scale of production and the anticipated scale of production is going to go through the roof. We're going to get to a tipping point within a very short period of time, I would imagine, where you're going to walk onto a forecourt and 30% of the cars, 40% of the cars, 50% of the cars are going to be electric vehicles, at which point they're just going to be called vehicles, and you'll be talking about the petrol car there. And you only have to go back to the 80s. Remember, nobody bought a Betamax for a reason. It was a redundant technology. And that's what's going to happen to the fossil fuel cars. It's just, are you going to buy the technology of tomorrow, of the past? And people just aren't going to do that. So, it's just going to change. Electric vehicles are going to come on the second-hand market, which is going to make them more affordable. There's going to be more competition from manufacturers. The technology is being produced at a bigger scale. That brings the cost down. And eventually, the whole market of electric cars will just sort itself out, and it will probably happen a lot quicker than you're expecting. But, I mean, Devon and I will both tell you this, that, there's that famous picture of this is how much of a road is occupied by people in a car, and this is how much of a road is occupied by people in electric cars. And electric cars, really, at the moment, when we've got a gas-powered power station, the only environmental benefit is the immediate local pollution of nitrogen dioxide and particulates.
There is a great piece of technology that the Poor have been using for a very long time to reduce their carbon emissions through transport, and it's called a bus, and it's called walking. I mean, people on lower incomes have been they emit much, much less carbon than people higher up the scale. I mean, when we look, at least on a global level, more than 50% of all emissions are emitted by the top 10% and another 20% by the top 1%. It's like an income distribution. But more than that, I mean, we have to find a way of redesigning our cities to be more livable and move away from vehicles more generally. The problem with moving toward electric vehicles to some extent is you're still going to need to find a place for them to park. There's no parking in Douglas. just practically it's not going to work. And secondly, there is no more tolerance to have additional traffic, particularly if we end up going ahead with the Eastern Area Plan. Traffic over Calder Bridge is going to quadruple. So we just don't have the capacity to handle that. If we have more people living where they work, and like living in towns and living around other people, we can rebuild that sense of community, and we can solve a number of problems at once. And one of the best ways we can do this is by converting empty office blocks and empty commercial units back into housing, converting old hotels that are no longer in use back into housing, or into housing in the first place. And in that same way, we can sort of try and solve multiple problems using single solutions.
Well, we've got quite a traffic jam, a log jam of comments coming in now. So it's great that we've got a good audience who are keen on participating and get involved. So thank you for that, and keep your comments coming in. So I'll just fire some bullets at you, boys. I don't want any long answers, but there's been a bit of a discussion on the sidelines here as we're going along. So thank you, Simon Costain, again for some very good informed commentary about housing. He's got it right every time. You know, electricity has got to be made less expensive for those running air source heat pumps, and commitments to targets for house building, social first-time buyer and sheltered. So we as an island can afford to do that, and it's an absolute scandal why we haven't. But I'm just going to run down the list, and I'm just scrolling down. We've got quite a lot coming in, and I've got Kevin who is challenging Devon. Okay. So we're talking about a news item that came up, and this featured in the Times, and there must have been some commentary on this about the asylum seekers, and it's saying, I would like to clarify something. Devon has recently stated that he would support asylum seekers by allowing an amount to come to the island. How would this fit in if we already have a housing crisis with our own residents? What would his plan be to house asylum seekers if we can't house island residents? Now, just say this was a very speculative piece of journalism. There's nothing to clarify or quantify this. The Isle of Man government has said that there's been no conversation, but you wonder how the story emerged. But Devon, can you just give us a background? We don't want to spend too long on this because really we're talking about green issues and housing crisis, but 30 seconds, go.
The focus is on the wrong type of foreigners. So the type of foreigners who are driving up housing prices are not your ordinary immigrants and refugees. They're multimillionaires who are coming in and buying up the vast majority of the housing stock, driving up prices and turning homes into buy-to-let investment units, right? It's not a Syrian that is like driving your prices up, or sort of like ruining the housing and sort of like acting as a slumlord. It's local homegrown people, or people who've come over to sort of invest primarily. So the fact is taking in 10, 15, 20, maybe even 100 refugees isn't going to have the same sort of concern long term as allowing the vast majority of like absentee landlords or people who own second, third homes but don't reside on the Isle of Man. So I think we can have holistic solutions that uplift people. We also need to recognize is that there's a giant labor shortage on the Isle of Man with regards to unskilled work. So 61% of all job vacancies on the Isle of Man, as they currently exist, people that demand labor, come from people who don't like are sort of unskilled positions. Bringing people in, integrating them into the economy means that 20, 30, 40 years, you have someone who's paid tax in their entire life, hasn't required schooling, and might end up going back home, as many refugees eventually do. And in the meantime, they're contributing and integrating into the economy. If Jordan, Uganda, and South Africa can take in refugees, then a very, very rich country like the Isle of Man can do it, right? The only choice is, are we going to participate in the international scene? A lot of people aren't going to like this, and I lose voters every time I talk about this, but it's just the right thing to do.
Thank you for that answer, Devon. All credit to you. You summarised it expertly, and really it was speculation in the Times, but I've got to agree with Devon there that we've got possibly hundreds of property owners, and there was a question in Tynwald this last week where they've actually realised you can't identify who is buying these houses, which is absolutely bonkers. So this is the Isle of Man government for you, that we've got hundreds and hundreds of houses and no one knows who is actually behind them. So that says so much about the control of our precious assets, which is property and land. And look, don't give it away. You hear so many jokes about, Comindara. Let's not even go there. We've had some lovely contributions coming in, and we've got Stephen Moore. Lovely picture there. So, Stephen, are you sure the whole world is moving away from fossil fuels? The West is, but the whole world can't agree with that. That's a good point. And now we've got something about the Northwest Passages helping Russia sell more. There's a link on that, so anyone who's watching, maybe when the show is over, can tune into that about the liquefied natural gas exports from Russia.
Sorry, I just want to interject. One more point is, so I know that there is a big concern that, okay, if we reduce our fossil fuels, are China and India going to do the same thing? The simplest response to this is why are China and India, why have they industrialized? Because they're making stuff for us. So this iPhone over here isn't counted within Manx carbon production. It's counted as China's, but they made it for me. If I become a better consumer on my end, I can directly decrease China's production of fossil fuels. But they are doing some incredible work over there in terms of doing this. Realize that they have a tenth of the income per person that we do, but they have planted 100 billion trees over 30 years. Yeah. They are going to hit their target of having peak carbon production by 2028, 2 years early, and they're probably going to have a stronger capacity to end up hitting their carbon neutrality target of 2060 once we sail right past ours, because they're actually devoting resources to this. If you actually look at satellite maps, the planet is more green than it was 30, 40 years ago, mostly due to mass tree planting efforts in China and India. So there are problems there, but we who have resources, we have produced most carbon over the total course of industrialization. Realize they've only been producing carbon for 20 years as they get up to space, get up to standard. We need to help them, and this needs to be an international effort. Not much that man can do to help China, but there's no one in Bangladesh or Ghana or Nigeria is going to reduce their carbon emissions when their carbon emissions are a tenth of ours. When they point at a rich country and say they can't be bothered, why can't we? So we need to have some degree of trust here.
I'll give you a bit of a rest there, Devon. Fire away, Andrew.
I think we also need to remember that the Chinese are the world's biggest investor in renewable energy, and it's China who's producing the solar panels at such a rate that it's brought the cost down at a rate that means it's now the cheapest form of electricity that's available. And we're seeing massive investments in solar energy in countries like Australia and India, which is causing the countries to have to rewrite their energy policies because it is so affordable, and they do have the climate that maximises the use of it.
And I'll just pick up on a couple of comments. Jared, thank you for your contributions and supporting Devon's viewpoints as well. Christian Davies, it would appear that the green energy revolution has been left in the hands of the private residents of the Isle of Man. That is a great point, because it has. It really has. It's almost the consumer choice that's being given. Grants for renewable energy is entirely dependent upon household income. It's a very low amount if there's no real government support for the vast majority of people who can and would invest in renewables. I mean, you go to the amenity site when you're taking down all your empties and what have you. There's quite a queue, isn't there? And it really shows that people are considerate, aren't they? They're thinking about it, they're doing the bit, but that's as far as they can go. Maybe doing a bit of recycling and a bit of home economics, but really, Andrew, that the choices are quite limited, aren't they?
I mean, we haven't had the tariffs that the UK have had, and I think that's probably down to EU directives that were obliging such things to happen. And we always had the situation that we had the MEA, that, the MEA, for all it charges a lot, we do have a very reliable energy supply for an island where, I can remember as a child, we used to have power cuts. I can't remember the last power cut we had. So, we do have a very secure, reliable energy supply. But why we didn't start investing many, many years ago and begin this process is beyond me. Devon talks about 2001, 2006. I can remember watching Tomorrow's World in 1989, and I haven't heard anything convincing or different from what Maggie Philbin taught me back then. So, I've known this for over 30 years, and we've just turned a blind eye to it. Our politicians are too upset, and I always say this is our problem. Our constituencies are so small that politicians get 10 emails and they're panicking because you might only have got in by 100 votes, and so you try and keep everybody as happy as you possibly can, and it stops people making difficult decisions. So you put a wind farm in and somebody gets upset.
Let's see how well that strategy goes. I've been in for a few months, and I've talked about redistributing certain amounts of wealth and being pro-refugee. So let's see if I absolutely just crash and burn in the next election. Because the whole policy of being considerate and sort of accepting views, even if they are absolutely wrong, isn't something I'm keen on. The time to sort of persuade people who are always going to fight against the good thing is over. We've got a lot of people who are going to resist doing the right thing, and sort of are going to scream and shout. But at the end of the day, we have to focus on what is the best thing financially, and that is sort of creating a society that is energy independent. If the Isle of Man can produce and create its own power, this is hundreds of millions of pounds that we are no longer sending to the Middle East, or sending to buy a Saudi prince a second or third or fourth vehicle, right? This is one of those in which we need to focus on shoring up our economy, and the only way of building a bit more internal resiliency is by focusing on energy independence. And I think there's a lot of benefits to green, to sort of investing in green issues. One of the strongest ones is the fact that IQs drop off massively if you're in an area of heavy pollution. And many areas, and this is something Andrew's pointed out, like Lord Street, have really high pollution levels. And this damages, this has been shown to objectively damage test scores. This damages childhood development. And in 30, 40 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to think, what the hell were we doing? How did we not deal with this earlier? It's the same way that when we look back at the fact that Romans used to have pipes with lead when water came down and they went absolutely insane. Or the fact that we had unleaded fuel, which drove a massive rise in crime. It's time to change.
Well, I've got the comment of the evening has arrived on screen. And it's from Alice, and it's nuts. We live in such a windy place and we aren't using any of it. How relevant is that? It is bonkers. It is totally bonkers when you look at the expenditure shelved out on the power station and some grand inquiry that didn't castigate anyone fully, and we're paying for it for years and years. And you've just got to put your head in your hands, haven't you, really? We've really, really missed the boat, Andrew. You must be feeling uptight and upset about that.
I can remember 20 years ago saying, why aren't we doing this? And it's people didn't like looking at windmills, and the politicians got scared. And, all right, we've arrived at the party late, but let's get on with it. And I think this is one of the things that Devon was saying, that, they've done a load of paperwork. Let's see something. The only action that I have seen since 2018, when we were protesting to start after the IPCC report, the only action I've seen is some trees being planted. Everything else has been on paper. Everything.
And we've not been duped by that. We've not been duped. We've seen right through it.
And this is something that Devon and I both said in council last week, because the council has actually had its own audit of its own carbon emissions. And that was the first question to David Christian. All right, we've got this audit. Now let's see actions. Let's see immediate actions. They're very simple. Let's see things happening. Let's not just write another report about it and write a program for this. And let's see things happening.
Well, I mean, the powers that be must feel guilty now when you just get that view in the morning, don't you, sometimes, and the clear skies allow you to see those hundreds of windmills just beyond the 12-mile limit. And we're not really getting a proper share of that. So just tell me, let's go back to the council, okay, and housing and public housing. What have you learned about the housing situation in Douglas? I know, Devon, you've been great. You've been going out and actually seeing the very worst. Devon, could you just remind us of that?
So I've seen absolutely atrocious accommodation, both owned by the council and both owned by private landlords. And the issue is people always come back to the fact is they say that they don't have cash to redevelop these properties. Individual housing officers are great. Individual members within the DY is great, but our system of governance doesn't allow us to effectively tackle problems that long term are going to cause massive discontent and create massive health issues. So you see places where some places are occupied by people that we call essential workers, but then there's black mold that covers the walls. There's rising damp. There is places that aren't fit for human habitation. And I lived in South Africa for the first 22 years of my life, and I saw some absolutely atrocious accommodation over there, and I see accommodation over here that would rival that. And we need to do better. And the way we do that is, one, by holding people accountable who've allowed this to happen for a very long period of time, and secondly, by actually investing long overdue resources in fixing these problems, because no human being should live in unfit accommodation.
And Andrew, your view? I mean, I can see the landscape of Douglas Town Centre being reshaped. I'll just relate my little anecdote, which was yesterday. Had a package delivered to the house, and I just said to the driver, "How many are you delivering today?" And he goes, 100. And I said to him, "Oh, how many vans has your business got? The company that you work for?" And he goes, "They've got 40. So they're all delivering parcels today through online shopping." Yeah, 100 each. So then you think about the Royal Mail, you think about the other delivery services. At a very conservative estimate, you've got 10,000 parcel transactions a day. Now, this isn't going to change, is it? The high street is obliterated through, various companies going bust and leaving the Isle of Man and so forth. Surely, now is the time for Douglas to get a grip and look, how can you somehow exchange the change of use, sort of find a reasonable reward to the property owner and turn it into something like townhousing? Is that an unreasonable suggestion or what?
Well, first of all, within the town centre, changing use isn't a problem. They changed the planning. They brought in a development order a couple of years ago. You can change all sorts of uses in the town centre. You can turn the floors above shops into flats without planning permissions, provided it meets certain criteria. So I don't think there's too much of a problem there. The story I hear when I speak to people is that we have a lot of our high street is owned by people who are very wealthy and will not drop their rents, and they don't care if the building's empty. And that's something I've heard several times, that people who want to open a shop, but the rent is just doesn't add up for them. So that's the biggest problem, I think, for some of the businesses that want to start up. With regard to internet shopping, I don't really know. We can't just ban it. So that's always going to be a challenge, and that's a challenge that every high street is facing. We also have the problem that, and this is something that it was actually Stephen Bradley, who owns various buildings, used to own Timble Mills, and he said, you've got to understand that the phenomenon that's happening in the UK affects us as well, and that's the gravitational pull of the city. You know, nobody talks about the death of the high street when they're in the centre of Manchester or Liverpool, because it's thriving. But as soon as you go to Bolton or St Helens, the story's very different, and it's this gravitational pull. And we have EasyJet, and that's one of the problems. He said that he reckoned that 1,000 people a weekend went away from the Isle of Man and spent their money in other places. We do have another problem as well, which is some of the big employers moving out of the town centre. I mean, we've seen it with Zurich. I can remember when the MEA had their offices in the town centre. I can remember when the hospital was fairly near the town centre. These were all taken out there, and these are lunchtime consumers who are just taken out to sit on an industrial estate. So these are all factors that contribute to the decline of the town centre. So the role of a town centre is changing, and it's how you address it. Devon and I have spoken about public art. I think the council's been doing a very good job with some of its events that they put on, such as the Christmas light switch on, which was a far bigger event this year than it had been for several years. They had the food fair that they had in the Villiers Square. So these events are happening, and that's very much the philosophy that they have of trying to have events, that it's an experience coming into town. But the thing that's probably most important of all is actually to have people living in town. So you have more convenience shops in town. So it's not, to rely on comparison shopping in the town centre isn't going to be the be all and end all. You need more convenience shopping, and maybe convenience shopping needs more short-term free parking. Maybe we do need to look at things like half-hour parking on the promenade, so you can run into Boots, get whatever you want, and get out again. It's those quick visits that people need. But then,
one of the big ideas of sort of redeveloping commercial business space that's actively used. So I'm going to link in a few threads here. So the third biggest reason that young people leave the Isle of Man, at least according to surveys, is the lack of a social life and the lack of a nightlife. So the businesses that definitely aren't suffering, the businesses that are booming, are places like the Outback and are places like 1886, bars, pubs, clubs. So people are no longer going to town because they have to get things. They go into town because they want to enjoy various experiences. And an experience is something that's very difficult you can't import an experience. You can't buy an experience via Amazon. So we need to reorient our cities around being places that people enjoy being in. And that is by having businesses that people enjoy and having a town that looks better. I know Andrew has spoken quite a lot about the fact that our town just doesn't look good enough. And a big way of revitalizing the internal part of a town is by pedestrianization, creating more mixed use. Could you imagine what it would look like if Strand Street had cars going through it, was just a normal busy road? It wouldn't be a destination that people would actually enjoy going to. So I think sort of expanding pedestrianized areas is the way that we reinvent and we redevelop towns long term, and we create spaces that people actually enjoy being in.
Well, we've had a comment on the board there from Simon, and Amazon and Co are predicted to shrink the high street by 30%. Well, I really think that the solutions lie in with multiple property ownership. I think the solutions lie in with rezoning areas, maybe accepting that the retail landscape is got to change. It's changing already. We do our shopping online. I mean, Douglas, with the business prevention strategy, aka the promenade, where you don't even know whether it's open, which way to go, or what's going on. I think there's a number of factors that have killed it. COVID hasn't helped, and I think a lot of people staying at home has meant that they're going to be shopping online. So it needs... I can't see a problem with having affordable first-time buyer style housing in the high street and round and about those office blocks. I just cannot see an argument against it, because there is no way that department stores are going to come back to the Strand Street area. It ain't going to happen, Andrew.
No, but the problem with building houses, and particularly on tight urban sites that have had buildings on before, is it gets a lot more expensive than building on a greenfield site. It's almost like a contradiction about talking between affordable housing and redeveloping in town centre sites. It's more expensive, and it's how do you incentivize that? And if you are to make it affordable, do you then start to compromise on such things such as parking provision? Do you increase, as soon as you start putting basement parking in, your scheme gets more expensive? Do we start to look at things within the strategic plan and go, well, actually the things that are pushing the prices up, such as the affordable housing quota or the public space contributions, do you look at them and just say, well, what's the most important thing to actually get buildings built and get people living there, even though if they're more expensive? Or do we go down the route that probably Devon would go for, which is the state goes and builds some housing there as a long-term investment in putting buildings in the centre of the town, get something in at ground floor that's interesting, and get people living there and stimulate the economy in the area.
Well,
and improve the appearance of the town in the process.
I think it's fair to say that the state has to get involved, because we don't know who these property owners are. We don't know what their intentions are. I do think that in time to come we're going to have to create legislation that controls and manages these multiple property owning cartels and magnates that seem to have a super strong grip on the island. And I can't see a way around it, because we've only got 220 odd miles of square miles of land to deal with, and this is what the island makes it so special, is that we're privileged to live here, and I think everyone should have a fair share. So we're just coming up to the hour. Just to summarise, guys, Devon, you've been outstanding tonight with the performance. Brilliant to listen to you. Some great ideas, some good facts that you've pulled out as well. Anything you'd like to finish off with? Because in the background there has been quite a set to on. Let me see, new people to the Isle of Man in the comments box, but I think we'll just park that to one side for the moment. We can talk about that maybe another time. But Devon, you'd just like to finish off?
Why can't we have 1 million refugees move to the Isle of Man? I think this is the I'm kidding. Sorry, that's to be the policy I write for elections. I mean, I think people are going to get, I guess there's another statement could work. Workers of the world, unite. You've got nothing to lose but your chains. No, but in all seriousness, I think that when we look at the sort of problems we can have sort of innovative solutions that use government as a tool to make our lives better, rather than just a thing that sort of maintains the status quo for the sake of maintaining the status quo. And I think we can invest in solutions that invest in working and middle class people, and improve the environment and ultimately create a better world. And I think this is a sort of shared project that we're really excited to be in, and I'm really hoping that ordinary people respond to it. I mean, once we invest in public art and urban fruit trees and better housing and sort of better, safer streets, I'm hoping that people will look at government and say, we can do something better, and they'll engage and start using the government as a way of sort of improving their lives and improving the lives of their friends, family, and neighbours.
And Andrew?
Let's invest for the long term. That's the important. Let's have a long-term view of everything. Let's not just go for quick fix solutions. We tried that with the Irish scheme. We tried that with the energy from waste plant. Let's look for long-term solutions to problems.
Well, thank you, Devon and Andrew. That has been a good insight, I think, for a Facebook Live. That is top of the tree, really. And thank you so much for everyone for commenting and taking part. We'll hopefully host another one again, but we did have a bit of a kick-off about the asylum seeker issue, which I think it was dressed up as fake news, but let's just put this into perspective. You can imagine anyone Googling the Isle of Man at the moment, and what are they going to find? We've got the worst rates at the moment for COVID, and look at it on the other side of the scale. We've got so many people who own properties on the Isle of Man, and our government doesn't even know who they are or where they're from, and that the properties are actually being owned for gathering profit from hard-pressed rent payers who are finding it difficult to climb the housing ladder. So we'll leave it with you there. It's been great to have your company this evening, and I'll hold you that you're going to come back again sometime.
100%.
Yep, it's always available, Jed.
Well, thank you very much, folks.